Have you ever heard stories of people who came back from hell? What if I told you there are detailed reports with terrifying descriptions from individuals who claim to have seen and felt what exists on the other side? What really happens in the moments between life and death? Could hell be real? These accounts come from people all over the world. Doctors, soldiers, civilians, and even staunch atheists. All of them claim to have experienced something that completely changed their lives. Today you will hear some of these cases that challenge both logic and science. But be warned, some of these stories may be disturbing. If you've made it this far, it's because something inside you wants to understand more. So leave a like and subscribe to follow more stories as impactful as this one. Now get ready. Howard Storm was a skeptical university professor with no religious beliefs until the day he was taken to hell. In 1985, he suffered a perforated stomach and entered a near-death state. In the hospital, he felt his consciousness leave his body and saw himself surrounded by dark beings, calling him to follow them. At first, Howard walked with them, but soon he realized they were becoming increasingly hostile. He described an environment of absolute darkness, where screams of pain echoed in the distance. The creatures began attacking him, tearing at his flesh and mocking his suffering. He tried to fight back but was powerless. Despair took hold. He couldn't see a way out. Then, in the midst of the torment, a childhood memory surfaced in his mind, the word Jesus. Without knowing why, he shouted the name. Instantly, a bright light appeared and the creatures fled. But what really happened? Was it a genuine experience or just a trauma-induced hallucination? Another terrifying account is that of Dr. Rajiv Party, an anesthesiologist who never believed in life after death. In 2010, he underwent emergency surgery and had an experience that would change his perspective forever. He describes being dragged by an invisible force into an endless tunnel where he saw deformed beings, chained and screaming in agony. The air was filled with a putrid, sulfurous smell. He heard demonic laughter and felt an oppressive presence crushing his soul. The despair grew, and he realized he was at the mercy of something far beyond his comprehension. But just like in Howard's case, something unexpected happened. His deceased father appeared, surrounded by light, and pulled him out of that place. He woke up in the hospital, convinced that hell was real. What causes so many people to report similar experiences? Is the human mind capable of creating such consistent hallucinations? Or is there something beyond our understanding? If you want to learn more about these terrifying visions, keep following the channel. There are many more shocking accounts coming soon. Subscribe and turn on notifications so you don't miss anything. The case of the young pastor. Many believe that only skeptical or faithless people have visions of hell. But what about when a devout pastor claims to have been taken there? This is the case of Brian Melvin, a young Christian who, after contracting a severe infection, had an experience that challenged his very own beliefs. He recounts that upon losing consciousness, he found himself in a vast, dark desert. The ground was dry and cracked, and in the distance, he could hear screams and wails. Suddenly, figures began to emerge from the darkness. They were distorted shadows, some vaguely resembling humans, but something was wrong. Their faces were frozen in expressions of absolute terror. He was pulled into a ruined city, where beastly creatures watched over the torments of countless souls. Among them, he recognized familiar faces, people who, in life, he never imagined would be there. Some had been religious but lived by appearances, while others were spiritual leaders who had strayed from their path. What Brian saw terrified him. Souls trapped in endless cycles of suffering, crying out for help but unable to escape. Some tried to flee only to be pulled back by invisible forces. Brian then noticed something even more frightening. A giant shadow appeared before him. It was not an ordinary demon, but an overwhelming presence that seemed to absorb all the light around it. He couldn't move, he couldn't breathe. His body felt as though it were being crushed by unbearable pressure. It was at that moment that he began to cry out in desperation, and just like in other cases, a light appeared. He awoke in his hospital bed, completely transformed. The experience was so real that he devoted his life to warning others about the dangers of hell. But the big question remains, why do so many people have such similar accounts? Could it be a mechanism of the brain during moments of extreme stress? Or a hidden truth about existence, the point of no return? While many who have had visions of hell managed to return, there are those who reported something even more terrifying, the feeling that they were being prevented from coming back, as if they were on the edge of an abyss about to be swallowed forever. This was the case of Ronnie H., a man who, after an overdose, was declared clinically dead for several minutes. During that time, he described falling into an endless space, surrounded by unbearable heat. What terrified him the most was not just the incessant screams, but the absence of any hope. He recounts trying to scream, run, and cling to anything, but it was as if he were being pulled into a whirlpool of darkness. Grotesque figures approached, whispering incomprehensible things. At one point, one of these entities grabbed his arm and said something he would never forget. "You won't return." In that instant, he realized that hell was not just a place of punishment. It was a place where pain had no end and where time did not exist. Absolute despair took over him, and that was when he felt a force pull him back. Upon awakening on the ambulance stretcher, the paramedics were surprised that he had come back to life. Ronnie, however, did not feel relief. He felt dread. He knew that for a moment he had been on the verge of an eternal fate and, according to him, next time, there might be no return. What is even more striking is that his account is not unique. Many people who have had near-death experiences have described similar sensations. The idea of a point of no return, where consciousness dissolves into absolute suffering. But what lies behind these accounts? Are they merely hallucinations caused by a dying brain? Or is there something much greater, something that challenges human understanding? The testimony of a doctor. Many might argue that these experiences are simply daydreams of ordinary minds. But what about when a doctor, a professional trained in science, claims to have seen hell? This is the case of Dr. Eben Alexander, a neurosurgeon who throughout his life disbelieved in the existence of anything beyond the physical world. His view changed drastically when, in 2008, he fell into a coma due to severe meningitis. For 7 days, his brain was inactive, with no activity sufficient to create dreams or hallucinations. However, when he woke up, he brought with him memories so vivid and detailed that they completely changed the way he viewed life. Unlike other accounts, Dr. Alexander did not begin his journey in a place of torment. At first, he found himself floating in a dense darkness, feeling completely isolated. He describes this part as the realm of mud, where amorphous forms slithered and murmured in a language he couldn't understand. The place seemed to pulse with negative energy, and he felt as though he was being watched. Gradually, figures began to emerge from the darkness. Deformed creatures, some vaguely resembling human faces, writhed around him. The smell of sulfur was suffocating, and the only emotion present in that place was absolute despair. But the most terrifying moment came when he felt something approaching, a massive presence, invisible but radiating pure terror. He described it as an evil consciousness that seemed to devour all hope. It was not just any demon, it was something much worse. Dr. Alexander was on the verge of being lost forever when a light appeared in the distance, pulling him out of that nightmare. He woke up in his hospital, surrounded by doctors who were stunned by his recovery. The impact of this experience was so profound that he wrote a book detailing his journey and began questioning everything he had once believed. If a neurosurgeon who spent his life studying the human brain can claim that there is something beyond death, what does that mean for us? The judgment of souls. Many of those who claim to have seen hell describe not only the suffering of the souls, but also a terrifying moment, the judgment. They speak of an overwhelming presence that made them relive every mistake, every wrong choice, as if their very consciousness were being exposed before an incomprehensible force. This was the case of James Carter, a successful businessman who, after a severe car accident, was declared dead for nearly 20 minutes. During that time, he says he was ripped from his body and taken to a dark courtroom. There were no walls, no ceiling, just an infinite and oppressive space. In the center, a gigantic throne shrouded in shadows. He couldn't see who was sitting there, but he felt their overwhelming presence. Before him, grotesque creatures held scrolls that, according to him, recorded every act of his life. He tried to argue, tried to say that he had always been a good person, but then the visions began. He relived every lie, every betrayal, every moment when he had done something wrong. And the worst part, he felt the impact of his actions on his own skin, as if he were experiencing the pain he had caused others. James Carter describes that, at the height of his despair, a voice echoed throughout the courtroom. "You know what your fate is." It was at that moment that he was pulled backward, feeling as if he were falling into an endless abyss. The fire began to consume him and he screamed, begging for mercy, but there was no one to hear him. He felt as though he was about to be swallowed forever when, suddenly, everything disappeared. He opened his eyes in the hospital, surrounded by doctors. The experience was so real that he completely abandoned his old life. He says it was not a dream or a hallucination, it was a warning. But the question remains, are these judgments real? Is it true that upon dying, we really face the consequences of our actions? The road to hell. Some people who have had visions of hell report not only the torment, but also the feeling that they were led there by a specific path, as if there were a road to eternal suffering. This was the case of Lillian Brooks, a woman who suffered a heart attack and was technically dead for 7 minutes. During this brief period, she claimed to have been guided through a tunnel that, at first, seemed similar to the reports of positive near-death experiences. But something was wrong. Instead of the comforting light that many describe, there was a reddish pulsating glow, as if the tunnel itself were alive. The walls appeared to be made of twisted flesh, and muffled screams echoed around her. The air was dense, filled with an unbearable stench of sulfur and burnt flesh. As she moved forward, she felt herself being pulled by an invisible force. She tried to resist, but the more she struggled, the faster she was dragged. It was then that she realized she was not alone. Other people were in that tunnel, some desperate, others accepting their fate with empty stares. Lillian's desperation grew as she began to hear whispers around her. Voices called her name, mocking in malevolent tones. She knew that if she didn't escape, she would never return. In a final act of desperation, she screamed with all her strength, pleading for help. It was then that she felt a sudden pull, as if being torn away from that place. She opened her eyes in a hospital bed, surrounded by doctors and nurses, who said that she had miraculously come back to life. Since then, Lillian insists that that tunnel was real, and that many people have walked that path without ever returning. But what frightens her the most is the memory of those voices whispering her name, as if they were still waiting for her. Is there really a road to hell, traveled by those who are about to cross a point of no return? The voice of darkness. While many people who have had visions of hell report terrifying images and landscapes of despair, there is something even more disturbing that appears in various testimonies: a voice. It's not just the screams or murmurs of tormented souls. Some claim to have heard a presence speaking directly to them, a voice from the depths, heavy with power and malice, capable of freezing any trace of hope. This was the case with Daniel Reeves, a man who suffered a heart attack after a severe motorcycle accident. During the minutes he was clinically dead, he said he found himself in a darkness so thick it felt tangible. At first he thought he was dreaming, until he realized he could hear his own breath and feel the cold ground beneath his feet. Suddenly a whisper cut through the silence. "You know who I am?" Daniel felt a chill run down his spine. The voice was not loud, but it reverberated within his mind as if it were everywhere at once. He tried to run, but his feet seemed glued to the ground. Then the voice continued, "You belong to me." In that instant, he saw shadows moving around him. They were tall, distorted figures with empty eyes that reflected a reddish glow. The sensation that something was about to grab him made him scream with all his might. That's when he woke up. The heart monitor was beeping frantically and the doctors were in shock. They hadn't expected him to come back. Since then, Daniel says that voice has never left his mind. He can't explain what he encountered, but he is certain of one thing. It wasn't just a hallucination. It was something real, something that continues to wait for him. But the big question is who or what was speaking to him? And why do so many people who report near-death experiences describe a similar voice, as if they are marked for something much worse? The last glimpse before the abyss. Among the numerous accounts of visions of hell, there is something that few can describe without shuddering: the moment before the fall. That instant when a person feels they are about to be swallowed by the abyss, with no chance of return. This was the case with Matthew Holden, a former police officer who had a near-death experience after being shot during an operation. According to him, as soon as he lost consciousness, he felt as though he was being pulled out of his body. The hospital, the doctors, the sounds of the emergency room, all disappeared in a matter of seconds. When he opened his eyes, he was at the edge of a giant cliff. The hot wind blew against his face and the smell of sulfur was suffocating. He looked down and saw an ocean of flames stretching as far as his eyes could see. But what truly terrified him was what he saw within the fire. There were human shapes, thousands, perhaps millions, twisting and screaming, as if being consumed by something beyond the fire. He described that some figures seemed to try to climb the walls of the cliff, but black hands emerged from the shadows to pull them back. Matthew felt something behind him. He dared not look. Everything inside him screamed that if he turned to see what was there, he would be lost forever. But then he heard a familiar voice, his deceased mother, calling his name. It was at that moment that he woke up. He was on the operating table with doctors trying to resuscitate him. Since then, he was never the same. He abandoned his career, moved to a simple life, and began sharing his story with anyone who would listen. According to him, hell is not just a metaphor, it exists. And once you glimpse the abyss, you can never forget it. But are these experiences truly glimpses of what awaits us after death? Or are they just manifestations of humanity's deepest fear? The secret hidden in the accounts. With so many testimonies throughout history, an inevitable question arises. Why do accounts of visions of hell follow such similar patterns, even when they come from people of different cultures, religions, and time periods? Many scholars and researchers have analyzed these experiences and noticed that, despite variations in the details, there are recurring elements: the feeling of falling or being pulled downward, the presence of dark or tormented creatures, the smell of sulfur, and the feeling of extreme heat, an entity or malevolent presence watching or interacting with the person, the absence of time, as if the suffering were eternal. One case that reinforces this theory is that of Rebecca Palmer, a woman who overdosed and was technically dead for about 5 minutes. During that time, she claimed to have been taken to a completely isolated place where the silence was absolute. But gradually, she began to realize she wasn't alone. Shadows moved around her, twisting and whispering in an unknown language. The ground beneath her feet seemed to melt, as if she were slowly sinking into something that felt alive. She tried to run, but there was nowhere to go. She felt trapped in an endless void where only despair existed. Then she heard a faint laugh at first, but it grew until it became deafening. Suddenly, an invisible force pulled her back, and she woke up in an ambulance. Since that day, Rebecca has never doubted the existence of hell. But what would explain these similar similarities between the accounts? Are they merely manifestations of the human unconscious in the face of death, or is there truly a place of torment, waiting for those who cross the final boundary? The most frightening part is that, despite scientific theories trying to explain these experiences as hallucinations or chemical reactions in the brain, the people who have gone through them firmly claim it wasn't a dream, it was real. The secret hidden in the accounts. With so many testimonies throughout history, an inevitable question arises. Why do accounts of visions of hell follow such similar patterns, even when they come from people of different cultures, religions, and time periods? Many scholars and researchers have analyzed these experiences and noticed that, despite variations in the details, there are recurring elements: the feeling of falling or being pulled downward, the presence of dark or tormented creatures, the smell of sulfur, and the feeling of extreme heat, an entity or malevolent presence watching or interacting with the person, the absence of time, as if the suffering were eternal. One case that reinforces this theory is that of Rebecca Palmer, a woman who overdosed and was technically dead for about 5 minutes. During that time, she claimed to have been taken to a completely isolated place where the silence was absolute, but gradually she began to realize she wasn't alone. Shadows moved around her, twisting and whispering in an unknown language. The ground beneath her feet seemed to melt, as if she were slowly sinking into something that felt alive. She tried to run, but there was nowhere to go. She felt trapped in an endless void where only despair existed. Then she heard a faint laugh at first, but it grew until it became deafening. Suddenly, an invisible force pulled her back, and she woke up in an ambulance. Since that day, Rebecca has never doubted the existence of hell. But what would explain these similarities between the accounts? Are they merely manifestations of the human unconscious in the face of death, or is there truly a place of torment, waiting for those who cross the final boundary? The most frightening part is that, despite scientific theories trying to explain these experiences as hallucinations or chemical reactions in the brain, the people who have gone through them firmly claim it wasn't a dream, it was real.